Coming up,
Thought I'd get out and vote early and exercise my right to vote.
how early voters have turned out in force
We're voting for the head of our state.
in a race with unexpected twists and turns.
I am suspending my campaign for the re-election as governor.
First, there were 3. Now, there are just 2 main contenders.
If you have a safe community, you can have a growing community. But it will take all of us.
And that's what this campaign is going to be about, is what's Alaska going to look like in the future?
Ahead, how a race that didn't seem like it was much of a contest may come down to the wire.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief that the best is yet to come, bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. Well, no matter which candidate you support, one thing is true: Alaska will soon have a new governor.
Alaska is at a turning point. It's at a crossroads.
People feel our great dream of Alaska is slipping away. Well, I believe in what's possible.
On Thursday night, 2 of the top contenders in the governor's race faced off here at KTVA for the last major debate of the season. Voters saw 2 very different candidates in Mike Dunleavy, the Republican in the race, and Mark Begich, the Democrat. And joining us now for some political analysis, 2 people who have been following this election very closely. Tom Hewitt, the opinions editor for the Anchorage Daily News, and Matt Buxton, editor of the Midnight Sun, an online publication that focuses exclusively on Alaska politics. So we are really happy to have you here. Now, the KTVA debate, I asked you both to watch that on Thursday night. Did we learn anything new from that debate?
I think there were some, not necessarily surprises, but certainly some fleshing out of positions. I think on crime in particular, there was more of a focus on restorative justice, especially from Mr. Begich, and that's somewhere where I think that there hasn't been a lot of focus because most of the messaging has been on repealing Senate Bill 91 or basically the failures of criminal justice reform, but you know, it kind of pivoted a little bit to kind of some more solutions-based stuff that's really necessary if we're trying to reduce the number of people who are reoffending.
I mean, I think we saw last night why Mike Dunleavy hasn't shown up to so many debates. You saw just how much Mark Begich's sort of skills and polish with politics and experience really played out, I think, as far as the performance debate, I think it was much better, yeah.
Well, we have a clip here that we want to share with you, and this kind of shows an interesting dynamic between the 2 of them, some sparks flying. Let's watch.
So you've been in the legislature. Why haven't these 2,000 positions been filled?
I don't have the answer to that. Oftentimes, you fund a position. Some of these positions may have been funded years ago for specific purposes, but the administration, for reasons that I don't understand, has not filled these positions, and we're not sure where the money has gone.
Yeah, I know you have something to say. Go ahead.
I mean, when I was mayor, I managed a workforce of 3,000 people, an incredible, almost $750 million budget. Actually, that number has been disputed by many people. There's not 2,000 funded positions, because if there were, I would have expected the legislature, you hit it right on the head, Joe, that they would have found that money and utilized it to plug the gap of the fiscal problem of the state. That is not an accurate number, Mike. You've used it over and over again.
So what is significant about this exchange? What does it reveal?
Well, I mean, I think that it's major because Mr. Dunleavy has campaigned largely on a message of, you know, that it's possible to close that budget deficit largely using cuts, and that 2,000 job figure, which could, using his math, provide as much as $200 million in savings, to kind of find out, you know, by way of the debate, that that's a lot kind of squishier than people might have thought. You know, it's not exactly, you know, there isn't this big, you know, pool of money somewhere that you can just very easily take back and roll into the state's budget. That, I think, is really difficult, because all of a sudden, you know, that was the biggest single part of Mr. Dunleavy's cut plan, and so to not have that in place all of a sudden it makes the math for closing that budget deficit with cuts and primarily cuts, much, much more difficult.
Well, the other thing, too, is he was on the Senate Finance Committee, so you would think theoretically that he would have an understanding of how there are placeholder positions. They're not necessarily funded.
I mean, I think, and that's why I go back to saying that I think Begich had a stronger performance last night, just because I mean, this is, like you said, this is one of the core positions of Dunleavy's platform as far as the budget goes, and you know, it was really dismantled last night. I think the best line that he had in it was that, you know, if this money was really there, they would have already cut it.
So it's an interesting one that we really haven't heard.
Yeah.
So it was the first time for that, and maybe it's partially because Dunleavy has not really engaged Begich one-on-one as much, and you know, I mean, it's just been a couple of weeks really since it narrowed down to 2. Well, the other really big battleground in this campaign is Alaska's Permanent Fund dividend, and you know, I want to take a look at some graphics. We have the basics of Dunleavy's PFD restoration plan. You want to talk about that a little bit? What the main centerpieces of that are?
Well, it's the PFD and the PFD and more PFD. So, I mean, basically, you know, he's arguing to go back to the full 1982 PFD formula. You're talking about restoring the dividends that were cut in the last 2 sessions, one by a veto of the governor and the other by the legislature. And so we're, you know, the full payout, I think the math comes to around about $6,700. And that's a huge, you know, that's...
It'd be a lot for a family of 5 or 6.
Yeah, but it's really big for the state budget. I mean, this is still money that has to come from somewhere. I think the cost estimate is around $4.5 billion, and so it's a pretty significant look at how you're going to impact the budget. Yeah.
So, do you think that the success of Dunleavy's pitch for this is that you basically get voters by appealing to their pocketbooks?
I think that's a big part of it, and I think there's a kind of a populist appeal to the sense that, you know, this is money that you should have had all along. But, you know, the trick, of course, is that if you know, as anybody knows, if you aren't, you know, kind of putting money aside and you're just budgeting as you go along, and you know, it's harder to kind of find a big pot of money, you know, as anybody who's like had a car die on them and all of a sudden you need $10,000 to go out and get a new one, you know, you don't usually budget to have that big chunk of money just sitting there. And so, you know, the state would have a difficult time with that, and it would really deplete a lot of the state's savings.
Well, let's look at what one expert has said, and this was taken from a column in your newspaper about what the experts say. This is David Teal, the legislative fiscal analyst. He says, paying high dividends gives you less revenue, gives you bigger deficits, and to me, that's just math. That's pretty, a pretty I mean, that's scorching statement there.
I think that was a pretty good point during last night's debate, too. Joe Vigil was pointing out, you know, asking really why, you know, where is this money going to come from, right? You know, this is $4.5 billion, and the answer is out of our savings account. And that savings account, you know, is filled with the dividend, or filled with the permanent fund earnings, and it's limited. And so, you know, and once that account is depleted, there really is no more dividends there. So that's where you get into Begich's argument about why his plan is more responsible and more, you know, the long-term facing. So I guess, you know, for voters, it's kind of a decision about, you know, whether you want it now or you want to have some kind of dividend long into the future.
Well, they tangled, so let's watch.
People of Alaska do not trust the government now. The legislators that I'm talking to are in full agreement to pay a full PFD. I'll put this in the budget. This will be one of the first things that goes in the budget to make sure that we restore trust from the people of Alaska in their government officials. So working with legislators like I'm doing now, I believe that we can make this happen.
So I want to clarify something. Do you want to recoup some of the losses of Alaskans that they received over the last 3 years? You want that money to come back to them and put it right in their pocket?
My goal is to pay a full PFD and to go back and make sure that Alaskans get the PFD that was also cut.
Okay, so based on that, that would cost several $1 billion.
That's correct.
$6 billion.
That's correct.
1/3 of
That's
their
correct.
earnings.
It would. It
And
would.
where,
As opposed
where are you
to
going to find $6 billion?
$19 billion in the earnings reserve. There's $19 billion in the earnings reserve.
So is that where we're getting it?
That's correct.
$6 billion.
Yes.
Joe, let me, if I can, this is the problem. The fund has $47 billion in the corpus, $19 billion in the reserve. When you combine it, that's the calculation that then determines the dividend, when you calculate on the full fund. When you start diminishing the earnings reserve, it's going to have a direct impact. Now they'll say, and I know what Mike will say, well, we take it out of the earnings reserve. That's correct. There was a time under Frank Murkowski when they almost couldn't pay it because there wasn't enough money in the earnings reserve. So this calculation basically says we're going to give you a little gimmick and prize today, but down the road, which will be short order, there won't be money for the future generations. His daughter, my son, your friends and family. That is the problem with his plan. There's not one person who has said his plan is economically sound for the long term.
Pay me now, pay me later. Well, when we come back, we'll look at some numbers. Why we should see strong turnout at the polls. Despite the heavy voter interest in this year's election, there are still some undecided voters out there.
I feel like this is a really, really important election that's coming up.
We went to the post office in Midtown and found a number of undecided voters. So why is it so hard for them to make a choice? Well, they gave us a variety of reasons. One complained he's being forced to decide between the lesser of two evils.
I don't know, I can't, neither one of them really ring my bell.
I'm a Democrat, but it's really a difficult choice because I like Mark Begich, and Dunleavy is promising to give us back our PFDs from the last 3 years. So it's a little difficult choice.
Definitely a lot of the ads out there right now, and trying to get my way through a lot of the mudslinging that you're seeing with all, like, especially the governor ads that are going on right now.
Some voters told us that they hope to carve out time soon to go through the election division's voter guide, and they could be right down to the wire with that on election eve, taking a look at that. Procrastination, procrastination, Alaska voters. But this year, boy, it's really different. Tom Hewitt and Matt Buxton are back with us to talk about the fact that really there aren't that many undecided voters, at least from Ivan Moore's polling. But do you think that those undecided voters could make a difference in this race?
Oh, I think absolutely. It's a very tight race, and the real X factor is how many people out there support Bill Walker and are confused about the fact that he's dropped out of the race. He has dropped out of the race, for anybody who's watching this, in case you were unaware.
You were in a cave somewhere.
But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, whether he gets 2% or 5%, that could make a real difference. And it's also not really clear who that helps or hurts if he gets more of a percentage.
Well, I'm going to take a look at Ivan Moore's tracking polls. And let's start off with the one that just kind of shows the trends in the race, because I think this shows you the impact of Bill Walker's dropping out of the race. Look, you know, what happened between October 12th and October 19th. And then, of course, Begich kind of dropped down a bit, but that gives you a real good look. And let's look at what happened after people were given the survey. The respondents were told that Walker dropped out of the race. And then you see that actually Mark Begich kind of suddenly is in the lead with a margin. And look at positive, negative ratings. We see that Dunleavy has pretty much had the same positive out of this race throughout. And then but his negative has gone up, probably because now Mark Begich has money to run some negative ads. And then Begich's positive rating has come up. So, you know, it's an interesting portrait, but how do you feel about these polls?
Well, I mean, it's a time-honored tradition to sort of dismiss whatever Ivan Moore does. And he's historically had some kind of off polls in the past, but I think it's really important to be looking at these as a tracker poll. You know, this is, you know, we have multiple different results over multiple different days, so we can kind of see how things are changing. So whether or not exactly how accurate these numbers are is, you know, we'll find out, but we at least see the trends, in which the trend is looking really good for Begich at this point in the race.
And the trend is maybe what you want to follow, not so much the numbers. And of course, there's that margin of 5% for error. But do you think that this race will be one of those that we might be waiting for a week or so to tell, or will we just see Dunleavy grab the prize?
I think that's an absolute possibility that we could be up late on election night and longer. I think it's, at this point, you know, given how things have been all race long, it's Dunleavy's race to lose still. But there is a sense, especially after the departure of Governor Walker and him throwing his support and even, you know, some of the funds from the group that was backing him, you know, to go against Dunleavy and to help kind of support Begich's chances. There's a sense that momentum has swung, and it feels like a much tighter race. You know, I'd say it's still Dunleavy's race to lose, but, you know, Begich is coming on strong as we get into the home stretch here.
Well, everything is going to hinge on turnout. And what do you think are some of the key variables with that?
Well, I think, you know, one of the really big things to look at is just how many competitive legislative races there are right now. So you have a lot of Democrats making pretty strong pushes in districts that have been close in the past. You look at a couple in Anchorage, there's a couple up in Fairbanks too, and I think you look at those, and these people are kind of doing the groundwork a little bit for Begich, I think. And so, you know, if they can drive turnout for themselves, you know, that's kind of, I think Begich comes along with them. So,
well, what about Pebble Mine? Do you think that even though it looks like with all the money that the no vote, I'm sorry, ballot measure 1, which is basically about Pebble Mine in the backdrop there, but what do you think that's going to do?
Well, I mean, that's another place that's a big X factor because a lot of energy, time, money has gone into that campaign, a huge amount, you know, more than went into the effort to repeal the state oil tax, Senate Bill 21, which up until that point was the biggest initiative. So, you know, this is a big, expensive initiative, and people have very strong opinions about it, and the governor candidates are on different sides of this issue. And it feels pretty even there too. So it's it's basically about who gets their people out on election day for both that initiative and the governor's race.
Well, let's go back to the debate and watch this, because this is one place where I saw Mike Dunleavy get real passionate. So let's take a look.
I don't support Pebble Mine. I think that's the wrong mine, the wrong place, just like Jay Hammond and late Ted Stevens. I don't support it. I think it's a bad idea in the wrong place, because that fishery is a rich fishery. That is what they call the fish basket of the whole world in a lot of ways. I think there's a process. There's a federal process in NEPA that allows comments, but there's no state process here.
You might as well just set up some more latte shops and get ready for helicopter rides in from Hollywood. We need jobs. I mean, I lived for 19 years, I lived in rural Alaska. Some of the poorest people in the state of Alaska, they want jobs. They don't want welfare programs. They don't want to be taken care of by the government. They want jobs.
So one of the things that you see in this is I think one of the few moments where he was sort of unguarded in his passion.
I think it's telling too, because I think you know, up until now, one of Dunleavy's most important positions is the PFD, and I think, you know, now that the race has become head to head, I think he's kind of lost ground on that. But I think that there is a really big. You saw last night that there's a big pivot to ballot measure 1. So I think that's a key thing for Dunleavy to tie Begich to.
In the final days of the campaign.
And there's almost $12 million in that.
That is almost historic, I would think.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Tom Hewitt and Matt Buxton are going to stay with us. When we come back, some of the other races to watch and why there's a potential for some upsets. As of Friday morning, the State Division of Elections counted more than 24,000 voters for early voting. The division says that there are about 2,400 voters a day. Back in 2016, a year with a presidential race, there were about 2,800 voters a day. And compared to 4 years ago when Governor Bill Walker was elected, there were about 1,600 voters a day. That's one sign of how much interest there is in this year's race, which has drawn about 800 more voters a day. So You know, you were talking about that, Matt, earlier, that these races are legislative races are driving turnout too. We forget about that. So let's kind of quickly go through some of the races that are in play. And since both of you have worked in Fairbanks and know that terrain, let's start off with Senate District A, Pete Kelly versus Scott Kawasaki.
I mean, certainly the marquee race, Pete Kelly, the Senate president, and Scott Kawasaki, formerly in the, well, I guess currently in the House Majority Caucus and, you know, running for Mr. Kelly's seat. And, you know, that was supposed to be Kelly's race to lose, but Kawasaki's been campaigning very strongly, you know, strong door-to-door campaigner, gets out and sees everybody. So I'd say that's a toss-up right now.
I mean, there's a massive amount of money in that race right now. I think it's easily the most expensive legislative race, and I mean the impacts for how it could affect, you know, the political layout in Juneau is really big. You know, so Senate President Pete Kelly is, you know, the president of the Senate. You know, there's talk that potentially if Kawasaki Democrat can pull out a victory here, you know, we might see, you know, very different layout in Juneau. So, you know, maybe there's a Democratic coalition or a bipartisan coalition at the very least.
So let's move on to House District 15, Gabrielle Ledoux's seat. Lots of controversy. Do you think that she's going to squeak through on this one?
She seems likely to, just because she got the Republican nomination. There's a write-in candidate running against her, but it's not a district that the Democrats likely to win. It's hard to imagine enough people being motivated and writing in another candidate. I mean, it can happen. Murkowski showed us it can happen, but I'd be surprised.
Well, she was part of this Musk-Ox coalition, and another Musk-Oxer, Paul Seaton, is running as a nonpartisan in his Homer district in South Kenai. What are his chances?
I would say it's good. I mean, he's really well loved in his district. And he's got a big, you know, lead in fundraising right now too. It's hard to say though. I mean, whether it just, you know, you've seen a lot of the Republican Party come up pretty strong against some of these candidates. You know, Paul Seaton was a Republican, is now he's a nonpartisan running in the Democratic primary. So that whole thing is kind of untested waters that we'll see how it plays out.
So right in West Anchorage, a hot contention in what people call the Purple District. District 21, Matt Clayman, the incumbent, facing off against Marilyn Stewart, who has taken several stabs at this.
Well, it's a really interesting race because Matt Clayman is the one representative who is actually embracing criminal justice reform. You know, we just on Friday here had an op-ed from him saying, you know what, you know, these reform measures are working, and there's data actually that does, you know, from the Criminal Justice Commission that just came out that says that they are having an impact, a positive impact, and he's embracing that. So, you know, while everybody is running the other way and saying, let's repeal this, he's, you know, saying, you know what, wait, let's hold up and take a minute. This might be having the effect that we wanted.
Well, one final race, and there are about a dozen of these really fascinating ones. We just have about 20 seconds left. House District 23, Chris Tuck, the minority leader, fighting for his seat.
Majority leader.
I'm sorry.
But
that's right, majority leader now.
It's hard to know if he still wants that seat. I mean, he has kind of gone back and forth with it. He's not really been very active this year as far as fundraising. He's one of the few Democrats that's way down. But apparently he's got a good ground game going door to door.
All right, well, whatever your political persuasion, we hope that this program serves as a reminder to get out and vote. November 6th is a day when the voices of Alaska will be heard. So let's hope that it's a loud and clear one. Polls open Tuesday morning at 7, close at 8. If you live in Anchorage, the bus rides are free on Election Day as an added incentive to get out and vote. So be sure to tune in to KTVA Channel 11 and KTVA.com for all your election night updates. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.